He had always enjoyed the quiet life. His home was modest but comfortable, tucked away in a neighborhood where people knew each other but rarely interfered in each other's lives. He liked it that way. The mornings were calm, the birds would sing, and he could enjoy a cup of coffee on his porch without a single distraction. He had chosen this house for the privacy it offered, the little escape from the busy world. Little did he know that peace was about to be shaken by something he could not have predicted. The homeowners association in the neighborhood had a reputation. Some people in town joked about it, calling it petty, overbearing, and sometimes even unreasonable. But he had not paid it much attention. He had moved in knowing that the HOA existed, and assumed that as long as he followed basic rules, there would be no trouble. Rules about paint colors, lawn heights, and such things seemed manageable. He had always been careful to follow them, quietly maintaining his property as he saw fit. He liked to keep the yard neat, the flowers blooming, and the house clean. It was not about rules, it was about living comfortably. One morning as he stepped onto his porch, he noticed an envelope stuck in the mail slot. It was heavier than normal, and the seal was red with an emblem he recognized all too well, an HOA notice. He had received these occasionally, but they were usually minor reminders. This one, however, made him pause. It stated that he was violating a particular rule about the placement of garden ornaments. A small, tasteful statue of a bird he had placed near the flower bed apparently did not conform to some specific rule that was not clearly explained. The letter demanded that he remove it immediately or face fines. He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. A fine for a small statue? That seemed extreme. He had lived here for years, and no one had ever said anything about it before. For a moment he considered ignoring it, thinking it might just blow over. But something about the tone of the letter nagged at him. There was a sense of urgency, almost a threat in the words. He knew he had to respond, at least to make a note of it, so he placed the letter on the table and went inside to get a cup of coffee. The next few days were calm enough, but he kept an eye on the mailbox. Another letter came, this one more aggressive. This time it claimed that if the statue was not removed within 72 hours, a fine of $100 would be levied, and repeated offenses could lead to liens on his property. He stared at the paper, trying to keep his frustration in check. It was the principle of the thing. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being threatened as if he had. He walked around his yard looking at the statue. It seemed harmless, a small piece of art he had chosen with care. It brought him a sense of joy, watching the birds occasionally perch on it and hearing the faint sound of wind rustling past it. Yet here it was, suddenly a source of tension. He shook his head and thought about how absurd this was. He was a law-abiding citizen, a responsible homeowner, and yet the HOA seemed determined to make him feel like a criminal in his own yard. A few days later, an HOA representative showed up. He had seen them before, usually just waving as they walked past, checking the neighborhood in a polite, businesslike way. This time, however, there was no friendliness in their approach. They stepped onto his property, clipboard in hand, and announced that they were inspecting for violations. He greeted them politely, mentioning that he had received their letters. The representative seemed impatient and insisted on taking photos of the statue and measuring distances to ensure it did not breach the rule. He watched quietly, making no sudden moves. There was no harm being done, no danger. Yet here they were, making a fuss over something that should have been simple. He felt a growing sense of irritation. It was not just about the statue anymore. It was about respect. His property, his life, and his peace were being challenged without cause. But he kept calm, speaking politely, answering their questions, and explaining that he had followed all the HOA rules as he understood them. After the representative left, he sat down on the porch again, feeling the weight of the situation. This was just the beginning, he realized. The letters and visits were a warning, a hint that the HOA was not going to back down easily. He wondered why they were focusing so much attention on him, when other neighbors seemed to go about their lives without any interference. There was a hint of suspicion growing in his mind. Perhaps it was personal, or perhaps they simply enjoyed exercising authority over someone who had quietly minded their own business for years. Over the next week, he received another letter. This one was different. It included language about possible police involvement if he did not comply. The HOA had officially threatened to call law enforcement for what they called trespassing, because he had allegedly placed something on the property in violation of their rules. He read it carefully, noting the formal tone, the legalese that attempted to make their threat sound official. His initial amusement faded, replaced by a quiet determination. This was no longer a minor dispute. It was an escalation, and it demanded a response. He spent hours reviewing the documents, HOA rules, and letters he had received. He wanted to be prepared, to understand exactly what they were claiming and how baseless it truly was. He also considered how to respond without escalating the situation further, though he knew that at some point, escalation was inevitable if they continued to overreach. Meanwhile, neighbors began noticing the letters and the visits. Some whispered about how strict the HOA had become, sharing stories of small fines and warnings. Others were curious but hesitant to get involved, unsure how far the conflict would go. He preferred to handle things quietly without gossip or drama. Still, the situation was beginning to affect the neighborhood's quiet balance, the sense of calm that had always defined the place. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he sat on the porch and looked at the statue again. It was still beautiful, still harmless. He realized that what the HOA wanted was not just the statue, it was control. They wanted to assert their authority, to make an example of him, to show that rules applied regardless of reason. He felt a mix of frustration and resolve. He would not be intimidated. He would not give in to arbitrary threats, not when his rights as a homeowner were clear. For the first time, he considered the full extent of his own position. He had spent years in law, rising to a place of respect and authority, and yet here he was, challenged in a small, personal way by people who had no idea who they were dealing with. The thought brought a slight smile. He had the knowledge, the understanding, and the ability to defend himself, even if the situation remained tense for now. As night fell, he made a quiet decision. He would respond thoughtfully, calmly, and with all the tools at his disposal. The HOA might think they had power over him, but they had no idea of the depth of his knowledge or his resolve. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing a response that would make them realize their overreach and reconsider their aggressive stance. The quiet life he cherished was worth defending, and he was ready to do so with clarity and calm authority. The stage was set, the first moves made, and the battle of patience, principle, and power had only just begun. The days that followed were tense. Each morning he checked the mailbox with a cautious eye, wondering what the HOA would send next. Each envelope seemed to carry more aggression than the last. Letters now arrived with legal threats and warnings, as if they were trying to scare him into submission. The language was stiff, formal, and overbearing, claiming that failure to comply would result in escalating consequences. He read each one carefully, taking note of every claim and every threat. He could feel the eyes of neighbors, some curious, some whispering behind their hands. They watched as the conflict slowly unfolded, unsure who to side with or whether to get involved at all. Despite their attention, he remained calm and focused. He understood that losing his temper or reacting impulsively would only give the HOA more ammunition. His plan was simple: stay composed, know the law, and respond in a way that would protect his rights without unnecessary confrontation. The next visit from the HOA representatives was more formal and deliberate. This time, 2 people arrived at his front door, clipboards in hand, ready to inspect and document every inch of his property. They moved with authority, speaking as though every word they said carried legal weight. He greeted them politely, offering no resistance, yet he carefully observed their every action. They measured distances, took photos of his yard, and wrote notes on their clipboards. Everything seemed precise, almost obsessive. When he asked questions about the rules they claimed he had violated, they responded vaguely. There were no clear answers, only references to sections and clauses in the HOA handbook that were either outdated or misinterpreted. He listened, nodding and responding calmly, careful not to reveal any frustration. Inside, however, his mind was racing. He cataloged each misstatement, each exaggeration, each inconsistency. This would all matter later, when the time came to respond in a more formal, powerful way. After they left, he spent hours reviewing the HOA handbook. He compared their claims with the actual rules and found multiple inconsistencies. Some rules were ambiguous, some outdated, and some directly contradicted their threats. He made notes, carefully documenting everything. This was no longer just about a statue in the yard. It was about understanding the system, preparing to defend himself, and ensuring that every move he made would be legally sound. Word of the escalating conflict began to spread in small circles. A few neighbors approached him, expressing concern and sharing stories of their own experiences with the HOA. Some had minor disagreements in the past. Others had been fined for trivial issues. All agreed that the HOA had a tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily, yet none had faced the kind of persistent attention he was now experiencing. He listened politely, grateful for the support, but he knew that ultimately, he could not rely on anyone else to resolve this situation. One afternoon, another letter arrived, this one more threatening than the previous ones. It warned that police could be called to enforce HOA rules if he failed to comply. The idea that law enforcement might show up for what was essentially a disagreement over a garden statue was both absurd and infuriating. Yet he remained calm. He understood that the HOA was attempting to intimidate him, to make him act out of fear rather than reason. He would not give them that satisfaction. He decided to pay a visit to the local law enforcement office, not to complain, but to clarify what actions the police could legally take in such a situation. He spoke with officers politely, explaining the situation and asking hypothetical questions about HOA authority, trespassing laws, and property rights. The officers were professional, explaining that HOA rules do not override state or federal law, and that any enforcement of trespassing without legal basis could put the HOA at risk. This knowledge gave him a small sense of reassurance. He now knew the boundaries of the HOA's power and could proceed with confidence. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed undeterred. They sent more representatives to the property, each visit becoming more intrusive and aggressive. One day, a representative even attempted to step into his backyard without permission, claiming that they needed to verify compliance with certain rules. He calmly stopped them at the edge of his property, explaining politely but firmly that they had no legal right to enter without consent. The representative hesitated, taken aback by his assertiveness, and eventually retreated, leaving him in quiet triumph. He documented everything meticulously. Photos, letters, dates, times, and conversations were all logged carefully. Each detail could be used to demonstrate the HOA's overreach and provide evidence that he had acted reasonably at every step. He understood the importance of a thorough record. It was not just about defending himself in the present. It was about creating a foundation for the resolution he knew was coming. At night, he would sit on the porch reflecting on the absurdity of the situation. The statue in the yard had become a symbol of something much larger: the tension between authority and personal rights, the delicate balance of power, and the length some organizations would go to enforce control. He smiled quietly at the thought that a simple piece of art had sparked such a series of events. Yet he also knew the seriousness of the matter. This was not just about pride. It was about standing firm against unreasonable intimidation. He began drafting a response to the HOA, carefully crafting each paragraph to remain factual, polite, and legally sound. He wanted to demonstrate that he was not intimidated, that he understood his rights, and that any further attempts at coercion would not be ignored. The draft included references to specific rules, inconsistencies in their claims, and reminders of legal boundaries. It was meticulous, precise, and measured. As the days passed, the tension continued to build. The HOA seemed frustrated by his calm demeanor, perhaps expecting fear or agitation. Instead, he responded with quiet confidence, refusing to escalate unnecessarily but prepared to act decisively if needed. He sensed that the conflict was reaching a turning point. The HOA's persistence was creating pressure, but it also revealed their lack of understanding about the situation and, perhaps, about who they were dealing with. Neighbors continued to notice the growing standoff. Some commented quietly about the increasing hostility of the HOA, while others observed his calm and composed approach with admiration. He preferred to stay in the background, letting his actions speak for themselves. He knew that the final outcome would be determined not by gossip or emotion, but by clarity, preparation, and a firm understanding of the law. One afternoon, as he walked through his garden, he reflected on the strange series of events. The HOA's insistence on control had created an unusual tension in what had always been a peaceful neighborhood. Yet through it all, he remained grounded, focused on facts rather than emotion, and ready for the next step. He knew that maintaining composure was as important as knowing the law. Patience and precision were his allies. He made a final note of readiness. The next step, he knew, would be crucial. The HOA might attempt to escalate further, perhaps involving authorities or neighbors in their pursuit of compliance. He was prepared for every possibility. The letters, the visits, the threats, all of it was being cataloged, analyzed, and prepared for an eventual response that would not only defend his rights but also make the HOA reconsider their aggressive tactics. By the end of Part 2, the tension was palpable. The HOA had escalated, the neighbors were watching, and the protagonist was calm, confident, and ready. Every interaction, every letter, and every visit had built a foundation for what was to come. He knew the path ahead required patience, strategy, and unwavering commitment to fairness. The stage was set for the confrontation that would test the HOA's authority against reason, law, and quiet strength. This was no longer a small neighborhood disagreement. It had grown into a situation that demanded careful navigation, courage, and the certainty that justice and preparation would ultimately prevail. By now, the tension had reached a new level. The HOA's persistence had become almost a daily challenge. Each time they sent a letter or attempted to visit the property, he felt a mix of irritation and quiet amusement. They had no idea whom they were dealing with, and that gave him a sense of calm power. He knew their threats had no real weight against someone who understood the law as intimately as he did. One afternoon, the HOA sent a representative to inspect the yard again. This time it was clear they were trying to catch him off guard, hoping that he might make a mistake or react emotionally. He welcomed them with a polite smile, inviting them to inspect within the bounds of the law. As they measured and took photos, he calmly asked questions, pointing out inconsistencies and ambiguities in their claims. The representative grew visibly flustered, unable to answer clearly. He noticed the hesitation and made a mental note. This was exactly what he needed for his eventual response. Back inside, he began preparing for the next stage. He collected all correspondence, photos, notes from inspections, and references from the HOA handbook. He organized everything meticulously. Each piece of evidence was a step toward showing that the HOA was overreaching, that their actions were unjustified, and that he had handled the situation with patience and reason. He knew the importance of a careful record. It would protect him, support his arguments, and demonstrate his calm approach in contrast to their aggressive tactics. In the following days, another letter arrived. The HOA was becoming more formal, almost desperate. They demanded compliance and threatened police involvement again, claiming that continued refusal could lead to trespassing charges. He read it thoroughly, noting every word, every implied threat. His strategy remained the same. Do not react impulsively, gather evidence, and prepare a precise factual response. He understood that emotion could undermine his position, so he kept calm, letting their panic subtly build against his steady demeanor. Neighbors had begun to notice the conflict. Some were curious, others whispered speculatively. A few approached him, sharing their own experiences with the HOA. Some had minor disputes, fines, or warnings. Others had quietly endured the same kind of overreach but had never confronted it. He listened carefully, appreciative of their concern, but he knew that ultimately, this was a personal matter that needed to be handled through facts, patience, and legal understanding rather than gossip or speculation. One evening, he decided to take action. He drafted a letter to the HOA, written in calm, precise language. It outlined every misstatement, every inconsistency, and every rule they had misinterpreted. He referenced dates, letters, inspections, and the legal limitations of HOA authority. The letter was firm but polite, a balance between authority and restraint. He wanted them to understand that he was not intimidated, and that any further overreach could have consequences for them, not him. The next visit from the HOA representatives was a turning point. This time they arrived with a sense of urgency, expecting confrontation or resistance. He greeted them calmly, guiding the discussion, and carefully explaining the legal boundaries they had crossed. He spoke with clarity, authority, and patience, highlighting their errors without anger or sarcasm. The representatives were unprepared for such composed confidence. They hesitated, questioned themselves, and seemed unsure how to proceed. The power of his calm demeanor was evident. While the HOA attempted to assert authority, They were now faced with someone who understood both the letter and the spirit of the law. He remained polite but unyielding, showing that knowledge and preparation could outweigh mere threats and intimidation. The representatives left with a sense of unease, realizing that their usual tactics had little effect against him. He continued documenting everything meticulously. Photos, dates, letters, and conversations were logged. Each interaction, no matter how minor, became part of the growing record of his careful, measured response. He understood that in disputes like these, preparation and patience were often more powerful than aggression. By remaining calm and consistent, he strengthened his position and made it increasingly clear that the HOA's actions were baseless. One evening, as he reflected on the situation, he realized the irony of it all. A simple garden statue had sparked a series of events that revealed the absurdity of overreach and the importance of standing firm. He had not sought confrontation, but he understood that sometimes defense required clarity, courage, and readiness to assert one's rights. This realization strengthened his resolve. He knew that the next steps would be critical, and he prepared mentally for the eventual showdown. Over the next week, tension continued to build. The HOA seemed to be escalating in small ways, sending letters and making visits that became more frequent, almost desperate. Each time he responded calmly, showing that their attempts at intimidation had no effect. His careful documentation of these events added to the growing sense of his preparedness and authority. Neighbors began noticing subtle changes as well. Some expressed quiet admiration for his calm handling of the situation. Others were surprised that he remained so composed in the face of what they perceived as persistent harassment. He preferred to remain discreet, letting his actions speak for themselves rather than seeking validation from others. He knew that the outcome would depend on facts, evidence, and calm determination, not on public opinion. He also reflected on the broader implications. The conflict highlighted the delicate balance between authority and personal rights. It reminded him that even organizations with power could overstep when unchecked. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his measured approach was teaching a subtle lesson, that reason, preparation, and calm authority could overcome arbitrary enforcement. This gave him confidence that the final resolution would favor fairness, not aggression. One day he received an unusually aggressive letter from the HOA, claiming that their next step would involve police intervention for trespassing. It was clear that they were attempting to escalate fear. He read the letter carefully, making detailed notes. He knew that such threats were often bluffs when faced with someone who understood legal boundaries. He also knew that his response needed to remain calm, factual, and authoritative. Emotional reactions could weaken his position. Careful preparation would strengthen it. That evening, he began preparing a formal response. It was more comprehensive than any previous communication. It outlined all previous letters, inspections, inconsistencies, and overreach. It emphasized that the HOA's claims lacked legal foundation, and that any attempts to involve law enforcement without justification could have serious repercussions for them. He crafted each paragraph carefully, ensuring it was polite, firm, and undeniable. This was not just a letter. It was a demonstration of his understanding, patience, and readiness to protect his rights. By the end of Part 3, the stage was set. The HOA had escalated their tactics, yet he remained calm, prepared, and unwavering. Every interaction had been recorded, every threat documented, and every response carefully crafted. The groundwork for the eventual confrontation was complete. He knew that the next phase would reveal the true dynamics of authority, reason, and personal rights. The HOA's overreach was about to meet someone who could not be intimidated, and the balance of power was shifting. The tension, preparation, and quiet authority had all led to this moment, where patience, knowledge, and strategy would determine the outcome. The day had arrived when the HOA's persistence reached a new level. They had sent another letter, this time with a stronger tone, implying that they would involve authorities immediately if he did not comply with their demands. He read the letter carefully, noting every word, every claim, and every implied threat. There was no panic, no anger, only a quiet resolve. He had been preparing for this moment, and he knew that patience and clarity would be his greatest allies. He decided it was time to respond formally. Sitting at his desk, he drafted a comprehensive letter that addressed every claim the HOA had made. He included references to specific rules, inconsistencies in their interpretations, and clear explanations of legal limitations. His words were calm, precise, and authoritative. He made sure to show that he understood their concerns, but also made it unmistakably clear that their threats and overreach were unjustified. This was not a letter written in anger. It was a letter written with certainty and control. When he sent the letter, he felt a quiet sense of anticipation. He knew that the HOA would read it, perhaps multiple times trying to find a flaw or a point of weakness, but there was none. Each statement was supported by facts, evidence, and legal understanding. It was not just a defense, it was a demonstration of his knowledge and authority. The HOA had been treating him as if he were an ordinary homeowner, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The following day, there was a knock at the door. 2 representatives from the HOA stood on the porch, looking tense and uncertain. They had expected resistance, perhaps frustration or argument. Instead, they were met with calm authority. He welcomed them politely and invited them to discuss the situation. The atmosphere was different now. The power dynamic had shifted subtly but unmistakably. They were nervous, unsure how to proceed, while he remained composed and in control. He began the conversation by calmly outlining the points from his letter. Each rule, each claim, and each threat was addressed clearly and logically. He explained that while he respected the HOA's role in the community, their actions had crossed legal boundaries. He emphasized that continued threats or attempts to involve authorities without justification could have consequences for them. The representatives listened, growing increasingly uneasy. They had expected a different reaction, and this calm authority unsettled them. As the discussion continued, he subtly revealed his background without boasting, by referencing his deep understanding of the law and the consequences of overreach. He did not need to state outright that he was a federal judge. The clarity and confidence in his explanations conveyed that naturally. The representatives began to realize that their typical tactics would not work here. Every threat, every attempt at intimidation had met with reason, preparation, and calm authority. He maintained a polite but firm tone throughout. There was no anger, no raised voice, only clear and undeniable logic. The HOA representatives shifted uncomfortably, their usual certainty replaced by hesitation and self-doubt. They had thought this would be a simple confrontation, but instead, they were facing someone who could not be intimidated and whose understanding of the law far surpassed their own. After a long discussion, the representatives left, leaving him alone with a sense of quiet triumph. He knew that the letter, combined with the calm but firm conversation, had shifted the dynamic completely. The HOA had realized that they could not bully him or manipulate the situation as they might have expected. This was not about victory in an argument. It was about establishing boundaries and making it clear that overreach would not be tolerated. In the days that followed, there was a noticeable change. The HOA's communications became more restrained, less threatening. They still sent letters, but the tone was cautious, almost tentative. They seemed to be testing the waters, unsure how far they could go without further confrontation. He remained calm, continuing to document everything carefully. Each letter, each visit, and each interaction was logged meticulously. He knew that a thorough record was essential, both for clarity and for potential future use. Neighbors began to notice the change as well. Some commented quietly, admiring his composure and the way he handled the situation. Others were surprised at the calm, authoritative presence he maintained, even in the face of repeated intimidation. His approach had demonstrated that patience, preparation, and knowledge could outweigh threats and overreach. The quiet strength he exhibited became a subtle lesson for the community. Authority must be tempered by reason and respect. He reflected on the situation late one evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. The conflict had started over something as simple as a garden statue, yet it had revealed so much about the nature of power, authority, and respect. He had not sought confrontation, but he understood that sometimes standing firm was necessary. His calm approach, careful preparation, and deep understanding of the law had turned the situation around. He had transformed what could have been a stressful and chaotic experience into a demonstration of reason, patience, and quiet authority. Over time, he noticed subtle improvements in the neighborhood dynamics as well. The HOA seemed less aggressive, more cautious in their communications with other residents. Some neighbors even approached him for advice, curious about how he had handled the situation with such calm and effectiveness. He shared his insights politely, emphasizing the importance of preparation, documentation, and clear communication. He did not boast, but his guidance was valued and respected. He also recognized the broader lessons from this experience. Standing firm, remaining calm, and knowing one's rights were essential when facing overreach. The situation had tested not only his legal knowledge but also his patience and composure. By maintaining a calm demeanor and addressing the issues with clarity and authority, he had shifted the balance of power and established boundaries that the HOA could not ignore. As the days turned into weeks, the tension gradually eased. The HOA continued to exist as an authority in the neighborhood, but their aggressive tactics had diminished. The conflict had become a subtle reminder of the limits of their power and the importance of fairness and reason. He continued to enjoy his home, his garden, and the quiet life he had cherished. The experience had strengthened his resolve and reinforced his understanding of the importance of standing firm when principles and rights are at stake. By the end of Part 4, the confrontation had reached a turning point. The HOA had realized that their usual methods of intimidation and control would not work against someone prepared, knowledgeable, and calm. The protagonist had demonstrated that reason, patience, and understanding of the law could prevail over threats and overreach. The stage was set for the final resolution, where the balance of authority, respect, and rights would be clearly established. The quiet strength, careful preparation, and unwavering commitment to fairness had brought him to a position of quiet triumph, ready for the conclusion that would restore peace and demonstrate the power of calm authority. The final days of the conflict were quiet, yet charged with a sense of resolution. The HOA had stopped sending aggressive letters, and their visits had become infrequent, almost hesitant. He knew the situation was reaching its natural conclusion. Their threats had lost power, and the calm, measured approach he had maintained was finally having the intended effect. The quiet life he valued was beginning to return, but he remained vigilant, documenting every interaction and communication. Neighbors had taken notice of the change. Some came by casually, asking how he managed to handle the HOA without losing patience. Others whispered their admiration, sharing stories of how his calm approach had reminded them of the importance of standing firm and knowing one's rights. He shared his perspective politely, emphasizing the value of preparation, careful documentation, and responding without emotion. He wanted them to understand that power should be met with reason, not with retaliation or anger. He continued to maintain his yard and home as he always had, tending to flowers, trimming hedges, and enjoying the small pleasures of life. The garden statue that had sparked the initial conflict now seemed almost symbolic of his patience and resolve. Every time he glanced at it, he was reminded of the importance of standing up calmly and thoughtfully when faced with unnecessary challenges. It had become a quiet emblem of reason, triumphing over intimidation. Though the HOA's direct interference had diminished, he remained prepared. He knew that persistence and vigilance were necessary in situations where authority could overstep. Each previous letter, visit, and inspection had been carefully logged, forming a record that could support him in any future disputes. This record provided a sense of security, knowing that he had maintained control and integrity throughout the entire process. One afternoon, he received a brief communication from the HOA. It was polite, almost formal, acknowledging the resolution of their concerns and confirming that no further action would be taken regarding the garden statue or other minor issues. The letter was a subtle admission that their threats had been ineffective, and that his calm, knowledgeable response had shifted the balance of authority. He read it carefully, appreciating the quiet confirmation of the outcome. The neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The tension that had built over weeks began to dissolve, replaced by the familiar calm of daily life. Neighbors went about their routines, the quiet camaraderie of shared space returning to the streets, and he resumed his peaceful morning walks and evenings on the porch. Yet the experience left a lasting impression on the community. It had shown that calm, reasoned action, combined with knowledge of one's rights, could overcome unnecessary aggression and intimidation. He took time to reflect on the lessons learned. Standing firm did not mean being confrontational. It did not require raising one's voice or showing anger. Instead, it meant preparation, patience, and a clear understanding of principles and boundaries. It meant documenting every action, anticipating potential challenges, and responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. This approach had preserved his rights, maintained his peace, and subtly reshaped the behavior of the HOA. He also noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood's dynamics. Other residents, inspired by his example, began to pay closer attention to their interactions with the HOA. They approached minor disputes with a greater sense of clarity and calm, documenting their actions and speaking confidently when necessary. His example had demonstrated that knowledge, patience, and quiet authority were powerful tools for maintaining fairness and respect in the community. As he worked in his garden one evening, tending to the flowers and trimming the shrubs, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The conflict had tested his patience, his understanding of the law, and his ability to maintain composure under pressure. Yet he had emerged with his dignity intact, his rights fully protected, and a quiet triumph that was deeply satisfying. The garden statue, once the source of conflict, now stood proudly among the flowers, a symbol of reason and resilience. He also reflected on the broader meaning of the experience. It was not just about a dispute with an HOA, it was a lesson in life. Challenges would come, often unexpectedly, and those in positions of authority might overreach. The key to handling such situations was calm preparation, thoughtful response, and unwavering adherence to principles. By maintaining these qualities, one could navigate conflict without sacrificing peace, dignity, or integrity. Neighbors continued to approach him with questions or admiration, and he responded with quiet encouragement. He shared insights about standing firm, documenting interactions, and responding thoughtfully to overreach. He emphasized that power was best met with reason, not confrontation, and that patience and preparation were essential for long-term resolution. His calm approach became a subtle, unspoken lesson for the neighborhood, influencing interactions and shaping behavior in small but meaningful ways. Over time, the HOA's behavior normalized. Their letters became standard and procedural rather than threatening. Visits were polite and brief. It was clear that his measured response had earned their respect and demonstrated the limits of their authority. The quiet, firm example he had set had reshaped the dynamic, ensuring that reason and fairness would guide interactions moving forward. In the end, he found a deep sense of peace. The neighborhood had returned to its quiet rhythm, his rights were secure, and the experience had strengthened his understanding of patience, preparation, and calm authority. The garden statue remained in place, a reminder that even small symbols could have great significance. It was a quiet victory, not just for him, but for the principles of fairness, reason, and respect that guided his life. As the sun set behind the trees, casting a warm glow over the yard, he stood back and admired the garden. Each flower, each shrub, each carefully placed ornament was a reflection of his patience and perseverance. The conflict with the HOA was now a memory, but its lessons were enduring. He had maintained his calm, upheld his rights, and shown that preparation, knowledge, and quiet authority could prevail against unnecessary aggression. Life returned to its peaceful rhythm, but the experience left a lasting imprint on both him and the neighborhood, a subtle reminder that reason and patience were the true markers of strength and authority. The morning of the hearing arrived with unexpected sunshine breaking through weeks of gray skies. Patricia sat in the gallery of Judge William Harrison's courtroom, feeling strange to be on this side of the bench. She'd known Bill for 15 years, respected his fairness and no-nonsense approach to the law. When the HOA's case had been randomly assigned to his docket, she'd immediately filed the proper disclosures about their professional relationship. Bill had reviewed everything and determined he could remain impartial. The courtroom filled quickly. Patricia noticed at least 20 residents from Riverside Heights squeezing into the wooden benches. Some were there to support her. Others, she knew, still believed the HOA's version of events. Dale Hoffman sat at the plaintiff's table with Brenda Mitchell and Kevin Torres, all three dressed in their finest business attire. Their attorney, Richard Westbrook, was shuffling through a thick stack of papers, looking far less confident than he had during their previous encounters. Patricia's attorney, Lisa Yamamoto, gave her a reassuring nod. They'd prepared thoroughly, but courtrooms were unpredictable. Evidence was one thing. How a judge interpreted it was another. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes crisp, his expression neutral. He was in his early 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He settled into his chair and surveyed the packed courtroom. "Please be seated," he said. "We're here for the matter of Riverside Heights Homeowners Association versus Patricia Chen, along with Ms. Chen's counterclaims. Before we begin, I want to make something clear to everyone present. This courtroom deals in facts, evidence, and the law, nothing else. I don't care about neighborhood politics or personal feelings. We're here to determine the truth. Is that understood?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Westbrook stood first, launching into the HOA's argument. He painted Patricia as a disruptive resident who refused to follow community rules, who intimidated board members, and who used her position as a judge to threaten legal action against volunteers simply trying to maintain property values. "Your Honor," Westbrook said, his voice carrying theatrical concern, "my clients are ordinary citizens who dedicated their time to serving their community. They were simply enforcing architectural guidelines that every resident agreed to upon purchasing their property. Ms. Chen's refusal to comply, followed by her threats of legal retaliation, created a hostile environment that made it impossible for the board to function." Patricia watched Dale nodding along, playing the role of the aggrieved volunteer. It was a convincing performance if you didn't know what had actually happened. When it was Lisa's turn, she approached the bench with a tablet and a calm demeanor. "Your Honor, the evidence will show this case has nothing to do with flower boxes or architectural guidelines. It's about a systematic pattern of discrimination, harassment, and abuse of power. With the court's permission, I'd like to present a timeline." Judge Harrison nodded. "Proceed." Lisa displayed the first document on the courtroom screen. It was Patricia's original approval from 3 years earlier, signed by the previous HOA president, clearly authorizing the window boxes. Then came the photos showing identical flower boxes on 7 other homes in the neighborhood, none of which had received violations. The selective enforcement began only after Ms. Chen declined to donate to Mr. Hoffman's wife's real estate business, Lisa explained. "We have emails showing Mr. Hoffman's wife, Catherine, soliciting Ms. Chen multiple times. When Ms. Chen politely declined, the violations began within 2 weeks." Westbrook jumped up. "Objection. That's speculation and irrelevant to—" "I'll allow it," Judge Harrison said. "Continue, Ms. Yamamoto." What followed was a methodical dismantling of the HOA's credibility. Lisa presented testimony from 11 different homeowners, each describing similar patterns of harassment. An elderly veteran named Harold Kim testified about being fined $2,000 for parking his classic car in his own driveway, while board members regularly parked boats and RVs without consequence. A single mother named Destiny Washington described being threatened with foreclosure over a $50 late fee while the board had quietly waived thousands in fees for Dale's friends. The most damaging testimony came from the HOA's former property manager, Rachel Diaz. She'd resigned 3 months earlier and had been subpoenaed by Lisa. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," Rachel said from the witness stand, her voice steady but emotional. "Mr. Hoffman told me explicitly to target certain homeowners. He kept a list. He called it his problem residents list, but it was really just people he didn't like or who'd crossed him somehow. Judge Chen went on that list the day after she declined his wife's business proposal." Westbrook tried to discredit Rachel, suggesting she was a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. But Rachel produced her contemporaneous notes, text messages, and email chains that corroborated everything she'd said. Then Lisa played the security footage from Patricia's doorbell camera. The courtroom watched in silence as Dale blocked Patricia from entering her own home. As he made the exaggerated call to police describing her as a threatening trespasser, as Brenda made a comment about Patricia not understanding how things work in established neighborhoods. Judge Harrison's expression hardened as he watched. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Westbrook, does your client wish to address what we just witnessed?" Westbrook whispered urgently with Dale, whose face had gone pale. "Your Honor, my client was acting in what he believed to be the best interests of—" "That's not what I asked," Judge Harrison interrupted. "I asked if he wishes to address the fact that he blocked a homeowner from entering her own property and filed a false police report." The courtroom was silent. Dale stood slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone. I made a mistake in judgment, Your Honor. The situation escalated, and I reacted poorly. A mistaken judgment, Judge Harrison repeated, his tone making clear what he thought of that characterization. He turned to Patricia. "Ms. Chen, would you like to address the court?" Patricia stood, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She'd rehearsed this moment, but had ultimately decided to speak from the heart. "Your Honor, I didn't want this fight. I wanted to live peacefully in my home. When I bought my townhouse 7 years ago, Riverside Heights felt like a real community. Neighbors helped each other. People said hello. The HOA existed to maintain common areas, not to control every aspect of our lives. But something changed when this board took over. It became about power, about punishing anyone who didn't fall in line. I'm a judge, so I had resources to fight back. But what about Harold, who's on a fixed income? What about Destiny, who's raising 2 kids alone? They couldn't afford attorneys or risk foreclosure. Someone had to stand up, not just for me, but for everyone who'd been targeted." She paused, looking directly at Dale. "I don't hate these people. I think they forgot that being on an HOA board is about service, not authority. I hope whatever comes from this case reminds everyone in every neighborhood that communities thrive on respect, not fear." Judge Harrison spent 20 minutes reviewing documents before he spoke again. When he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough. "I'm issuing my ruling from the bench," he said. "The HOA's claims against Ms. Chen are dismissed with prejudice. They are frivolous, unsupported by evidence, and appear to be retaliatory. Ms. Chen's counterclaims for harassment and discrimination have merit. I'm ordering the HOA to pay Ms. Chen's legal fees and $50,000 in damages. Additionally, I'm ordering a full audit of the HOA's enforcement practices and finances. If the patterns suggested by this evidence are confirmed, there may be grounds for criminal charges related to fraud and abuse of power." Dale's head dropped. Brenda was crying quietly. Kevin stared straight ahead, looking like he wanted to disappear. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "I'm recommending the State HOA Oversight Committee review this case for potential violations of fair housing laws. This behavior stops now." As the courtroom emptied, several residents approached Patricia to thank her. Harold shook her hand with tears in his eyes. Destiny hugged her tightly. Even some who'd initially supported the board apologized for not seeing what was happening. Outside on the courthouse steps, a local news crew asked Patricia for a statement. She kept it simple. "This was never about me being a judge," she said. "It was about being a homeowner who got tired of bullies. If there's any lesson here, it's that communities work best when we treat each other with basic dignity and respect. No one should feel afraid in their own home." 3 months later, Riverside Heights held a special election. Dale, Brenda, and Kevin all resigned rather than face a recall vote. The new board's first action was to repeal the most restrictive rules and establish an appeals process for violations. They brought Rachel back as property manager and created transparency requirements for all board decisions. Patricia's flower boxes still hung from her windows, now joined by dozens of others throughout the neighborhood. Every time she pulled into her driveway, she smiled at them. Little symbols that sometimes standing up to power was worth the fight.